There are words that seem tiny, yet they carry the weight of an entire world. When Miss Letitia Bastrop raised her voice in the main parlour of White Oaks Plantation on an April night in 1853, the words that left her mouth were of that kind. Very small, sharp as a seamstress's needle. Who invited the cook? This is a dinner for commissioners, not a distribution of manumissions. The laughter that followed tore through the parlour like fire through a dry cotton field. Crystal glasses rose with the wrists of women in silk. Gazes turned toward Sarah, standing near the dessert table in a grey linen dress she saved for Sunday service. She remained motionless. The hands that had cured fevers, wiped tears, tied a boy's laces, and closed the eyes of a dead mistress trembled at her sides as if they didn't belong to her. Young Master Gabriel had not yet come down the stairs, but he would come. And when he did, no one in that parlour scented with cigars and ambition would forget what was about to happen, because that night, before the most powerful men in Georgia, the heir to the Miller estate was going to say out loud what he had carried in his heart for years. This woman is not my nurse. She has always been my mother. And there the party would find a new owner. White Oaks Plantation stretched over more than 1,000 acres among the hills of the South, and in the year 1853 it still produced more bales of cotton than most Savannah merchants could move in time. Colonel Charles Henry Miller was a man of large hands and a thick voice, the kind who enters a room and makes the ceiling feel a few inches lower. He had the respect of his peers, the obedience of his overseers, and as he liked to claim at planters' meetings, absolute control over everything that happened within the boundaries of his property. What he never controlled and never quite understood was what grew between the walls of his son's room. Something that had no name in the accounting ledgers he prized so much. Sarah Miller, as she appeared in the plantation's imperfect ledgers, though the last name was an attribution from a previous master and not a blood heritage, had arrived at White Oaks, not yet 18, brought from a smaller estate that went bankrupt in Virginia. She had been a house slave since she was 12. She knew how to starch, cook, care for the sick, and pray in 2 different rhythms. The Methodist hymns for the masters, and her own rhythm for herself, in a very low voice she reserved for the middle of the night. She had something in her eyes that the elders in the slave quarters recognized from afar, the firmness of someone who has already lost much and decided, in some silent and private moment, that she was not going to lose herself anymore. When Mistress Mary gave birth to little Gabriel in February 1835, it was Sarah who stayed by her side during the 3 longest hours of that dawn. The county doctor had been called, but had not yet arrived. The smell of candle wax mixed with sweat and fear spread through the big house bedroom like a second presence. It was she who cut the cord with a boiled knife, who washed the boy in the basin of warm water, who placed him in Mary's lap and said in a low voice, firm as someone warding off a storm, "He's strong. Look at how he holds his breath." The mistress cried. Sarah did not. But when she went back to the hallway and stood alone for a moment, she leaned her head against the cold wall and closed her eyes long enough to store that moment in a place inside her chest where important things are never lost. Since then, Gabriel grew up between 2 women, the mother of blood whom he loved with the anxiety of someone who knows time is short, and Sarah, whom he loved with the constancy of someone who decided to stay even when no one asked. Colonel Charles Henry Miller traveled frequently, Savannah, Charleston, Richmond, where the cotton barons gathered to decide the fate of people who would never be invited to the meetings. In his father's absence, Gabriel learned the ways of the world from the woman in the kitchen. She taught by example and presence how to treat a sick animal without cruelty, how to apologize without losing dignity, how to look into the eyes of someone doing wrong without needing to scream. The April night in 1853 had been organized by Colonel Charles Henry Miller to celebrate a new export contract with a British company from Liverpool. The guests were the most relevant people in that corner of the South: the Baron of Beaufort, with a high-necked baroness and an ivory fan, 2 state representatives, Commissioner Harrison with a young second wife, and the Bastrops, a family of planters from across the river, represented by Miss Letitia Bastrop, a recent widow, mistress of an estate by inheritance, and possessed of a tongue sharper than a well-honed razor. Gabriel, nearly 18, had insisted to his father that Sarah come to the celebration. "She is part of this house," he said. Colonel Charles Henry Miller responded with a silence that was a no, disguised as patience. Gabriel did not back down. "If she doesn't come, I won't show up for the toast." The colonel yielded, but with a minimum concession. The slave could be present provided she was discreet, provided she was in the back of the room, provided she was as invisible as everything else he preferred not to see. Sarah knew this without needing it said. She knew she had entered through a crack, but the young master had asked, and there was something in that voice she hadn't been able to refuse since he was 5 years old. She arrived before the other guests, stayed near the dessert table and avoided eye contact. The grey linen dress was the best she had, but it looked out of place on a body the parlour was not expecting. The waiters, some of them enslaved like her, passed with trays without meeting her gaze. Out of respect or embarrassment, she couldn't tell. The music from the violinists brought from Savannah filled the air with notes that sounded beautiful, like things that are never meant for you. Sarah stood still, her feet firm on the floorboards, and thought about leaving before anyone saw her. She thought about it for a few long minutes, but she had promised the boys she would stay, and then Miss Letitia Bastrop saw her. Miss Letitia had the polished beauty and disguised cruelty of someone who never had to defend herself from anything in life. Widow of the master of Bastrop, with an inheritance she spent as easily as she distributed humiliations in women's circles, she had a habit of examining rooms like someone cataloguing threats and opportunities. When her eyes landed on Sarah, the result was immediate, like lighting a match. She walked slowly to the dessert table with her glass in hand and stood beside the slave for a moment, as if examining the sweets. Then she turned with the smile she reserved for situations that gave her pleasure. "Who did you come with?" Sarah answered without raising her eyes. "With Master Gabriel, ma'am." "Master Gabriel." Letitia repeated the words, savouring each syllable like someone chewing sour fruit on purpose. "And he asked you to come dressed like that. I imagined it was some new uniform I wasn't familiar with." Some nearby women heard. A muffled laugh rose to the right. Sarah tried to step back. "With all respect, Miss Letitia, I'll step aside." But the other woman placed herself in front with the naturalness of someone who never learned there are places she shouldn't be. "Nonsense, no need to leave. I just found it curious. Usually those who care for the children of the house stay in the back quarters during adult gatherings, but every plantation has its ways." More laughter. Colonel Charles Henry Miller was less than 10 paces away, his back turned, talking to Commissioner Harrison about the price of a pound of cotton. He did not turn around. Sarah stood tall, quiet. There was a glass of lemonade in her hand. Her hands shook a little, but her face did not change. She had learned early that the face was the only territory where an enslaved person could exercise some control over what the world saw. "I was invited by Master Gabriel," she said in the lowest possible voice, firm enough to be heard by those nearby. "Invited?" Miss Letitia repeated again, looking at the group that had formed around them. "How charming. And who will he invite next week? Old Uncle Silas from the yard?" The laughter that followed was louder now, open, shameless. One of the young wives of the representatives hid her smile behind a lace fan. Sarah turned to walk away. The movement was too quick, and the glass of lemonade slipped from her trembling fingers. The golden liquid splashed onto the white lace dress of the Baroness of Beaufort, who was passing through the aisle of the table at that exact moment. The Baroness's little shriek cut through the music. The parlour stopped. Miss Letitia raised her hands in a gesture of perfect theatre. "This is what happens when you mix the quarters with the dining room." The word quarters echoed. It was the first time someone had said out loud what had been hanging in the air since Sarah stepped into the room. Colonel Charles Henry Miller turned around. He looked at the slave. He looked at the guests. He looked at the cigar between his fingers. He made a minimal gesture with his head to the house overseer, a man named Jedediah, who guarded the parlour door with crossed arms. Jedediah approached Sarah with measured steps and a voice that tried to be mild. "Auntie Sarah, the colonel asks that you wait in the back." She nodded. She said nothing. She walked toward the door as if carrying cement on her back, her head bowed for the first time that night, her eyes dry. The parlour returned to the music. Letitia took another glass and twisted her lip like someone who had just done something useful. Everything went on, but not for everyone. Outside, in the hallway leading to the back garden of the big house, Sarah stopped and stared into the darkness of the cotton field. The April wind still carried the chill of the hills. She took off the shoes the young master had sent for from Savannah and stood barefoot on the cold stone floor. The nails she had cared for that afternoon, with the little she had already showed the marks of the effort to present herself as someone not expected to appear. She looked at the sky. No stars visible, only the lights of the parlor spilling through the high windows and the sound of the music continuing inside, tranquil as if she had never existed. "Sarah," the voice came from the dark hallway. Gabriel was running with his tie crooked and his jacket still poorly buttoned, breathless, his face red like someone who had jumped down the stairs. "I saw from above. I heard when I arrived. What she did to you, I know." She smiled slightly. The exhaustion in that smile had the texture of something ancient. "Nothing that doesn't happen, Master Gabriel." "Don't call me that now." He knelt in front of her as he had done as a child when confessing something only she would hear. "I promise this won't stay like this." "Don't do anything," she said firmly. "You'll ruin your name with the wrong people. It's not worth it." "You are my family," he said, and his voice broke a little at the end, like good wood that cracks not from weakness, but from weight. She stood up, put her hand on his forehead for a moment as if checking for a fever, as she had done so many times. Then she withdrew her hand, picked up her shoes and walked alone down the path she knew by heart, without looking back. Gabriel stood still in the stone hallway, watching the only woman who had never abandoned him disappear into the night as if she were nobody. But what he didn't yet know was that something had changed that day in a way that would only become clear in the days to follow, and that the events ahead would make that night seem like only the beginning of a much larger story. 12 years before that night of humiliation, little Gabriel was only 5 years old, and his body didn't know how to breathe. It was August 1841, and the crisis began in the carriage taking the family back from a visit to the Sterling plantation. The boy turned red, his mouth opened seeking the air that wouldn't enter properly, his eyes filled with a panic a small child shouldn't know. The heat of the August afternoon weighed on the carriage cover, and the smell of dry earth entered from all sides. Beside the boy, Mistress Mary screamed Gabriel's name as she grabbed his arms as if she could pull the air back through sheer love. It was Sarah who acted. Sitting in the front, she jumped to the back seat without hesitation, turned the boy's little body sideways, curved his torso slightly forward, and struck with an open palm between his shoulder blades 3 times, with the calibrated force she had learned from old Hattie, the eldest woman in the quarters who knew more about the medicine of the human body than any doctor who set foot on the Georgia plantations. A loud wheeze came from the boy's chest, a pause that lasted an eternity of seconds. Then the crying, the air returned. Mistress Mary collapsed on the carriage seat with her hands on her face. When she managed to speak, she looked at Sarah with eyes full of something that went far beyond common gratitude. "You saved my son's life." Sarah settled Gabriel in her lap, the boy's head leaning against her shoulder, his thin arms squeezing her neck with the strength only children know how to have. "He's like a son to me, too," she said in a low voice. The mistress reached out and held her hand for a long moment. "You are part of this family, Sarah." The sentence hung in the air of that August afternoon, as if it were meant to last longer than the people present. And it did. Something changed that day, and everyone on the plantation felt it, even those who would never have words to describe what it was. Gabriel started sleeping with an old cloth of Sarah's under his pillow. He said the smell kept the nightmares away, and she never asked which nightmare. In the makeshift school that the tutor of Colonel Charles Henry Miller held on the porch of the big house, it was Sarah who stayed nearby when the boy couldn't concentrate. She was the one who listened to the stories he told about the lessons, who adjusted the poorly folded notebook, who said, "Read it again, slower," without making the error a shame. She was the one who corrected with the firmness that doesn't hurt and then embraced with the warmth that heals. When Mistress Mary fell ill for good in 1844, spending her final months between the bed and the porch, looking at the cotton fields her husband managed from afar, It was Sarah who cared for both at the same time. For the mother who was saying goodbye slowly, asking for water, then silence, then someone's hand. And for the son who still didn't understand what saying goodbye means when it's to your own mother. The enslaved woman held this grief for two. She learned to sit between them and be the cord that kept them united when the disease tried to push them apart. Gabriel was 9 when the mistress died. Only the two of them remained. Every night before going to sleep, the boy would say something in Sarah's ear while she extinguished the lamp in the room. "You're my real mother, right?" She would smile. She never said yes. She never said no. She stood at the edge of the room for a moment. The light extinguished between her fingers, and that silence was an answer they both understood in the same way, with the precision of things that don't need words. Colonel Charles Henry Miller saw all this from afar, as if it were part of the plantation's landscape, like the cotton fields that existed to produce and not to be understood. He had lost his wife and thrown himself into business with the speed of someone who knows that stopping is dangerous. The sun grew. The enslaved woman cared. The cotton produced. This was the world he understood. On the morning following the humiliation in the parlor, the colonel waited for his son in the big house office, sitting behind the dark mahogany desk that had belonged to his father and grandfather before him. The room smelled of leather and beeswax, and the cigar he still held between his fingers, unlit since early morning. Gabriel entered without knocking. He stood with his hands clenched at his sides. What they did to Sarah was disgusting. Colonel Charles Henry Miller did not look up from his papers. It was an accident. She shouldn't have been there in the first place. She was there at my invitation. And it was a mistake on my part to allow it. Gabriel clenched his fists. She saved my life when I was 5. Mother had frozen. You were in Savannah taking care of business. The colonel laid the cigar on the edge of the desk. Gabriel. The voice was that of someone ending the subject. Sarah is a house slave of this plantation. She has the best treatment one can give, but the nature of things does not change because of a child's affection. The nature of things, Gabriel repeated, and the words in his mouth sounded like a sentence read in a language his father didn't know. What kind of nature is it that lets a woman be humiliated in front of everyone while you stand with your back turned watching? Colonel Charles Henry Miller stood up. His voice rose half a tone. You will learn, boy, that the world is not governed by feelings. Gabriel left without responding. The big house hallway smelled of the breakfast coffee Sarah had prepared before 5 in the morning as always, and that smell at that moment had an effect he didn't expect. He closed his eyes for a second. Then he went up to his room. He locked the door. He stood in the middle of the space for a time he couldn't measure. Then he went to the trunk where he kept Mistress Mary's letters, folded notes, a silver locket with her portrait when she was young, objects that have no market price. And at the bottom of the trunk, under a piece of blue velvet, inside an envelope sealed with red wax and with his mother's handwriting on the back, was his name written carefully. For Gabriel, when he becomes a man. He had found the envelope when he was 12, and his father had said, Your mother asked that you read it when you turn 18. Respect her wish. Gabriel had waited 5 years. And now, with the night of humiliation still burning, with Miss Letitia Bastrop's voice echoing in the corners of his memory like a thorn in a sandal, he looked at the envelope for a long time. Then he opened it. Mistress Mary's handwriting was small and slanted, like someone writing in a hurry to save everything before time runs out. My son, when you read this, I will already be gone. There is one thing I need you to know, and that I never had the courage to say out loud, because I knew the world we live in has no ears for it yet. But the world changes, and you will change with it. Or at least, that is what I pray to God every night. The woman who will care for you after me is not a servant, not a maid, not a wet nurse. She is the person who taught me what it was to be a mother, who saved my son's life when I was paralyzed with fear, and she acted with calm, with wisdom, with love that asks for nothing in return. She saved me too in other ways, so many they don't fit in this letter. If one day someone asks who raised you, who loved you without condition, who stayed when everyone left, show them this letter and say her name. Her name is Sarah, and she is more than family. She is the heart of this house. Gabriel read it 3 times. Then he folded the letter with the care one has for fragile things. The tears streaming freely down his face fell onto the paper, and he did nothing to stop them. He stayed like that for a time he didn't measure. Then he took writing paper from his desk and began to write. The week that followed passed with Sarah not knowing what was being plotted inside the young master's room. She returned to her big house tasks with the same discipline as always, woke before everyone, organized the meals, cleaned, cooked, cared for the house with hands that knew the place of everything without needing light. The other enslaved people in the house sensed something different without asking. Silas, who swept the yard since the first rays of sun, noticed that young Master Gabriel entered the kitchen earlier than usual and stayed for a few minutes watching Sarah work in silence, like someone storing in memory something he would need back. Martha, who cared for the pantry, told old Hattie in a low voice that the air in the big house was different. "It's just like before a storm," said the old seamstress. "But this time the sky don't look like a bad rain." On the 7th day, an envelope arrived for Sarah. Not through the overseer's hands, not through the usual plantation channels. Gabriel himself delivered it in the morning while she was peeling yams on the back porch, the smell of earth still on her hands. "I prepared something," he said. "I want you to come." She opened the envelope with her fingers still stained. Inside was an invitation written in his large, firm hand. Coming of age ceremony. Gabriel Miller, White Oaks Plantation. Guest of honor, Mrs. Sarah Miller. In the bottom corner, in the same hand, just one line, "The time has come for the world to know who you are." She read it in silence. It took a full minute before she sat on the edge of the porch step, her hand pressed against her chest like someone trying to hold what had just been stirred inside. Martha arrived with a bucket of water and stopped when she saw the expression. "What is it, Sarah?" The woman shook her head slowly. "Nothing, child. Go get my linen dress. The grey one." "The same one from the other night?" "That very one. But I'll need to iron it again." The coming-of-age ceremony for the sons of planters was a rite of that southern society, a moment when the heir turned 18 and the father presented him to his peers as the future of the estate, the symbolic transfer of weight and name. Colonel Charles Henry Miller had organized the structure of the celebration, the guests, the food, the musicians. But Gabriel had asked one thing of his father, with a firmness he wasn't used to hearing in his son. "I want a moment to speak before the toast. A speech." The colonel agreed, satisfied. Heirs who know how to speak in public are worth more in the market of alliances. He didn't know what Gabriel was going to talk about. The parlor of White Oaks Plantation was different on that second night. The same chandeliers, the same fine china, the same guests in their best clothes, saved for the occasions that matter. Miss Letitia Bastrop arrived early, in an emerald green dress and a smile that swept the room like someone inspecting conquered territory. She swirled her glass and spoke loudly to the group of ladies about what she expected from the young heir. Another one of these ceremonies for a pampered son who thinks he'll change the South before he learns how to sign an export contract. The women around her laughed with calculated discretion. When Sarah entered through the main hallway, the same Jedediah who had sent her to the back the previous week now bowed his head in a sign of free passage. She walked with her head held high, the same linen dress, the same shoes from Savannah. Whispers came from both sides, as they always did when a body that wasn't expected crossed a space that excluded it. She heard them. She didn't react. She had learned that reaction is what they expect, and not giving what is expected is the only form of freedom an enslaved person can exercise in that kind of room. Gabriel appeared at the top of the main staircase with the same crooked tie as always, as if his body resisted formality on principle. He descended slowly, his eyes sweeping the room until they found Sarah, and then he smiled slightly. The smile he reserved for her, and only her since he was a child. He took the silver bell used to announce dinner, the improvised microphone he had arranged with Silas before the party, and said in the voice that had deepened in recent months, without anyone quite noticing, "Good evening. Before any toast, before any music, I need to speak." The parlor went quiet with the speed that only spaces of power know, where silencing at the right time is also a way of affirming who is in charge. Many here know the name Miller. You know this plantation, you know the cotton it produces, and what that represents for Georgia. But today I don't want to talk about what I inherited. I want to talk about what I received for free. He extended his arm towards Sarah. She didn't move immediately. Her legs felt heavy as if the big house floor had changed texture. Miss Letitia rolled her eyes discreetly toward the woman beside her. Gabriel insisted with the gesture. Sarah walked slowly through the space between her and him, and each step was a step inside herself, a region she had closed off long ago to protect herself from what the world does when you open up. He held her hand. This is Sarah Miller. To the world of this plantation she is a house slave. To my father she is part of our home. To me... Gabriel took a deep breath, slowly. The whole parlor held its breath with him. To me, she is the person who taught me to walk, to think, to choose right when it was easier to choose wrong. She saved my life when I was a child, and fear had paralyzed everyone around. She stayed with me when my mother died, and I didn't know where to look. She raised me with the hands that the world of this plantation never thanked. And today I want to say what I should have said a long time ago out loud and with witnesses. He looked at the guests. Then he looked at Colonel Charles Henry Miller, who stood in the back of the room with a cigar in his hand and a face closed tight like a locked door. She is not just a nurse. Pause. And I have proof. What happened in the following seconds, no one who was in that parlor ever forgot. Gabriel made a gesture to Silas, who was positioned discreetly behind a small table with an envelope on it. The old man walked to the center of the room with the measured steps of someone carrying something heavy, handed the envelope to Gabriel with his head slightly bowed. Gabriel opened the wax seal carefully. The sound of the paper was the only sound in that space. Not even Letitia swirled her glass. Not even Colonel Charles Henry Miller visibly breathed. Gabriel read out loud. Every word of Mistress Mary's small and slanted handwriting landed in the parlor like a different stone on a path. The part about the fear of not having the right words for what needed to be said. The part about the carriage in August 1841, the boy without heir, and the firm hand that acted when love was paralyzed. The part about what Sarah had taught without knowing she was teaching. And the last line, which Gabriel repeated more slowly, letting each syllable occupy the space it deserved. If one day someone asks who raised my son, who loved him without asking for anything in return, who stayed when everyone left, say her name. Her name is Sarah. And she is more than family, she is the heart of this house. The silence after those words had a different texture than any previous silence in that room. It wasn't the silence of someone who doesn't know what to say. It was the silence of someone who knows very well and is carrying the weight of it in their chest without knowing exactly what to do with it. Gabriel folded the letter slowly. He turned to Sarah. She stood in the same place, her hand loose at her side, her face motionless with all the discipline she had built over decades. But her eyes couldn't take it anymore. Tears were streaming freely now, silent, like water that finds the path that was always there, but had been dammed for too long. You have always been my mother. The voice came out whole, without trembling. She went to the floor slowly, her knees buckling not from weakness but because there was a weight inside her body that needed the ground at that moment. He knelt in front of her, in the main parlor of the big house, on the noble wood floor that cost more than any slave was worth in the Savannah market. The two of them there, without jewelry, without titles, without the ornaments that society recognized as value, were the most real thing those walls had held in decades. The embrace that followed was the kind that doesn't need an audience, but the audience was there. The applause began in one corner of the room, weak at first, like someone unsure if it was permitted to applaud what they were seeing. Then stronger. A slow and real wave of people standing up, some without fully understanding what they felt, but feeling that something had been said that could no longer be undone. Some cried without realizing it. Colonel Charles Henry Miller stood motionless in the back of the room, the cigar between his fingers, the smoke rising alone, his face with an expression he had never trained for that kind of situation. Miss Letitia Bastrop tried to leave through the side hallway discreetly, but the women around her did not step aside. The wife of Representative Jenkins looked at her with a coldness that didn't need words. Another lady, the same one who had laughed behind her fan the week before, now turned her back to Letitia, with the deliberation of someone making a decision. Miss Letitia tried to speak, tried to construct some explanation, but the words came out loose and formless as they always do when the ground disappears from under one's feet. She left the parlor without an audience for the first time. Gabriel stood up, pulling Sarah with him. She stood beside him, her face still damp, her spine straight as it had always been, even in the worst moments. She looked at the room. Not with victory, with the peace of someone who is finally in the right place. Gabriel took the silver bell again. "There is one more thing," he breathed. "This plantation produces cotton, but it will also produce something else starting today. With the part that falls to me by inheritance, I will create a house of refuge, a house of care, for enslaved women and freed women who raise the whole world without ever being seen. Who stay, who heal, who teach, who save. She will be the administrator." He looked at Sarah with eyes still red. "And the first document I sign when my majority is recorded at the courthouse will be the deed of manumission for Sarah Miller, with her full name, with witnesses, with public faith, this very night." The parlor exploded. Later, when the parlor had emptied and the musicians were folding their instruments with the quiet exhaustion of those who work while others celebrate, Colonel Charles Henry Miller appeared in the hallway leading to the back garden, where Sarah sat in a wicker chair with her shoes in her hands. The hair she had pinned up for the party was beginning to come loose in strands. Her hands were still in her lap, for the first time that week, without trembling. The colonel stopped at the entrance of the hallway. The same imposition as always, but without the armor that imposition used to carry. Tired eyes. "May I?" he asked. She didn't respond immediately. Then she nodded. He entered slowly, stood still, not knowing where to put his hands, for the first time silent before her in a way that wasn't authority. It was something else. "I never understood what you were to my son," he said to the floor. "And worse than not understanding, I never wanted to understand, because understanding would complicate what I needed to be simple." She remained quiet. The crickets outside filled the silence with the sound they had always made, indifferent to what the humans inside the houses decided among themselves. "What happened tonight showed me how blind I've been, and cowardly." Sarah took a deep breath. "With all respect, Colonel, Gabriel didn't need an administrator. He needed a father." He swallowed hard. His eyes glistened, but he wouldn't let a tear fall there. He had enough control for that. Perhaps it was the only control he had left. "I ask your forgiveness, Sarah, for that night, for before it, for everything I let happen and for everything I didn't say." She stood up from the chair. "It counts, if it's sincere." He nodded slowly. "I lost my wife. I almost lost my son. And the only thread that kept this house together was you, and I treated that thread as if it were ordinary." She didn't respond immediately. She looked at the dark garden, at the outlines of the cotton fields she had seen grow for over 20 years. "There is still time to be a father, Charles," she said, using his name without the title for the first and only time. "But you have to start from zero, without pride and without an audience." He extended his hand with all the strangeness of a man who had never extended his hand to an enslaved woman, as a gesture between equals. She shook it firmly, without rancor, but also without naivety. From then on, he would have to earn forgiveness one day at a time, and they both knew it. A year later, on a street in Savannah that had gained a building unlike anything around it, a carved wooden sign hung above a door with a high ceiling and wide windows that let in the morning sun. White Oak's House of Refuge. Administrator, Sarah Miller. Inside, newly freed women filled out documents with the help of educators who had learned to read in the back of plantations. Small children ran through the hallways with the noise children make when they have space and no fear. Old Hattie, who had spent her whole life sewing in silence in the big house hallway, was now teaching other women to name the fabrics they made, to sign their names beneath what they created. Something changed on that day of inauguration, and those present would feel it for years. In a room overlooking the well-kept garden, Sarah organized papers, wearing glasses now, with a name tag written in Gabriel's hand, General Director. She dressed the same way as always, simple, without ornament. But her gaze was different, secure, at peace with the kind of calm that doesn't come from the absence of struggle, but from having struggled and remained whole. Gabriel entered without knocking, taller, quieter, with a smile he had learned from her not to save for special occasions. "Are you ready?" She looked over her glasses with the expression she had used so many times when he arrived, with that look of being ready for something she didn't expect. "I have always been." He extended his arm and together they walked to the entrance of the house, where a small ceremony had gathered neighborhood residents, former companions from the quarters, some planters who had changed their minds about what was possible, and in the back of the group, Colonel Charles Henry Miller standing alone, clapping slowly, with the gaze of someone still learning what he arrived too late to teach. Gabriel stepped onto the doorstep and said, "This house is an apology to all the Sarahs scattered across this country who raise, educate, heal and save without ever being seen, who stay when all others leave, who love without asking for anything in return. This house exists so they can exist in a loud voice too." Sarah reached the step beside him, took the small bell they had brought from the plantation, and said only, "Mother is the one who cares." The words Mistress Mary had said 12 years before, in a carriage in August, now engraved on the wood of the plaque and in the hearts of everyone there.